How's it going, everyone? Got another book review today. We are going to start talking more about shadow work. I realize now that uh, it's a topic that is covered so often elsewhere that I don't really talk about it much on here. But yeah, this is going to be um, a book review and also some advice on shadow work. This is the book that I recommend to people when people ask me, well, like how, like if you don't want to get into the Red Book and you don't want to get into Man and His Symbols by Jung, Shadow Dance by David Richo is extraordinary. There is bountiful metaphors in here. You being a king who doesn't know everyone in his fief and his land, and you need to address these unknown constituents, these unknown parts of your psyche, parts of your kingdom that you don't know. They've got some quarrels, they've got some claims, and they need to be addressed. And so that is one beautiful metaphor. Now, let's get into it a little bit. The thing that I like about this book is, well, one of the things that I like is it gives you philosophy and then it gives you practice. But we will begin with a bit of the philosophy. There is a way to recognize the shadow. This is on page 13. There is a way to recognize the shadow. What strongly attracts or repels us and others is a clue to where our own darkness lurks. As we begin accepting our shadow, we acknowledge our projections of our shadow qualities onto others as truths about ourselves. My hatred of your controlling ways may cloak controlling ways in me that I do not see. The negative shadow in us is projected onto others as strong dislike or disgust or attraction. The positive shadow is projected onto others as admiration or envy. Yeah. So now we're getting into light shadow and dark shadow, which is not something that's talked about very often. There are the parts of you that you don't integrate because you see them as undesirable. But there are parts of you that you don't integrate because, I shouldn't say that so factually. Let me rephrase that. In some people, there are potentially parts that they don't seek to integrate because they are seen as undesirable or disgusting. Conversely, there are parts of certain people that they don't integrate because they don't believe that they're worthy of that, or they don't believe they're capable even. That is a part of your shadow as well. The part of someone that wants to open a childcare center, but they don't think they have what it takes. That's part of your shadow. It's just the light shadow. Moving on. Another thing that I wanted to share was how this says here, the persona of a person may be shadow possessed. This happens when one is making no attempt to hide one's dark wishes or evil behavior. One does not put on any mask of goodness, but arrogantly acts out a bullying power over others. This can happen in an ongoing way, as with Hitler or a mafia boss or a psychopath. Some evil can only be dealt with by containment. It cannot be befriended or integrated, only stopped in its tracks, as a sudden light stops Dracula. Vampires and werewolves, like Fuhrers, are examples of possession by the collective shadow. That's one thing they relate to. So, I'm just going to sort of skip through some various parts about this book that I liked. My review is that it's a great book. My review is that you should read it if you haven't already. And my review is that the techniques and practices are very worthwhile and can be utilized to great success. Another thing that I like is it gives bilateral comparisons of healthy ego and neurotic ego, or integrated self and shadow. So the healthy ego observes. A neurotic ego denies or dissects. A healthy ego assesses. A neurotic ego judges and blames. A healthy ego will act in accord with assessments. A neurotic ego does not easily learn or put knowledge into practice. Healthy ego learns from mistakes. Neurotic ego repeats old mistakes. Healthy ego makes amends for mistakes. Neurotic ego denies responsibility or projects it onto others. Healthy ego lives in the present. The neurotic ego lives in the past or the future. The healthy ego makes choices that further life goals. Neurotic ego makes choices that cause pain and are self-defeating. The healthy ego is free from compulsions. The neurotic ego is compulsive and obsessive. A healthy ego is not moved or stopped by fear or clinging. A neurotic ego is caught in fear and clinging. A healthy ego lives in accord with deepest needs, values, and wishes. A neurotic ego accedes to the demands of others. Healthy ego can relate, make, and keep commitments and show intimacy. Neurotic ego is unable to commit, stymied by fears of abandonment or engulfment. Healthy ego will address, process, and resolve issues. Neurotic ego refuses to see, work through, or be accountable for problems. Healthy ego has mastery in the world. Neurotic ego is victimized by circumstances. Healthy ego is motivated and charged with initiative. Neurotic ego is driven by forces outside or impulses within. Healthy ego invents creative solutions in the moment. Neurotic ego resorts to self-defeating or inherited habits. Healthy ego has lively energy with serenity. Neurotic ego has nervous energy with anxiety. So, that's one example of that. Here is another one. This is a practice within Our Shadow Defined. Who are your 3 favorite and long-term heroes from books or films? List the characteristics of each of them. Draw pictures of yourself with each of them. What are the qualities in your heroes that are also your own potentials? Write the words and phrases on index cards and use one of them each day as a mantra or affirmation. Simply repeat the word while imagining your hero, then switch your own face with the heroes. Some of the most powerful techniques will be visual ones that have some golden thread of affirmation woven through. There are several more questions like this. I will read 2 more. Who are your 3 worst villains? Actually, we'll just do 1 more because this is a comparison. Who are your 3 worst villains or tyrants from books or films? List the traits of each of them. Draw pictures of yourself with each of them. What are the characteristics in these shadow figures that are also your own? Admit these to yourself and remember them for further work and future chapters. For now, acknowledgement is enough. If you're still watching this video and you perform these practices, you will see growth in one way or another. Let's do 2 more. Think of mother and father figures, wise guides, tricky characters, and the like, in books and films. How are any of these also like you in some way? Who are the people you have met along the way who fit into the various character archetype roles? How have they helped or hindered you? The animal you love, especially if it is one most people do not like, is a clue to your positive and negative shadow. For instance, to like crows because they are naughty, while most people consider them rude, impudent, and pesky may tell you something about your inner unexpressed aggression as well as your potential for assertiveness. The name Corbin relates to ravens and crows, Corvinus. And I can be a little bit crow-like sometimes. Which is your favorite animal? Which animal scares you the most? Which animal do you find most repulsive? Which animal do you find most admirable? How are the things in nature that most appeal to you, or what are the things in nature that most appeal to you or most repel you? How do your answers to each above questions reveal you to yourself? Okay. Moving on. Here is another section of questions, or sorry, of not questions, but of comparisons between the shadow of ego. Actually, this is all just shadow. So, everything that I'm about to say can be used negatively for neurolinguistic programming. So the way that I'm going to present it is going to potentially annoy some of you because it's going to be somewhat repetitive, but I'm doing this out of a protective measure so that I don't negatively program people listening. The shadow of ego says, everyone has to acknowledge my superiority. The shadow of the ego says, if I am wronged, someone will pay for it. The shadow of the ego says, rules don't apply to me. The shadow of the ego says, how dare you question me? The shadow of the ego says, it won't be done right unless I do it. The shadow of the ego says, I deserve a special deal. The shadow of the ego says, I become explosive if crossed. The shadow of the ego says, I'm never wrong. The shadow of ego says, I cannot tolerate having to ask or learn from anyone. The shadow of ego says, how dare you not realize I have to get my way. You have to do it my way, and you cannot override my decisions. Think for yourself or act on your own if you want to be close to me. The shadow of ego says, I have to be loudly appreciated for every accomplishment. The shadow of ego says, I can't be shown up or shown to be wrong. The shadow of ego says, I have to be excused for every mistake. The shadow of ego says, I may be highly insulted by the least slight. The shadow of ego says, I have to get the last word in. The shadow of ego says, I cannot lose face or lose ego. The shadow of ego says, I can make demands on you, but you cannot make demands on me. The shadow of ego says, I have to win, even at board games, at which I may be cutthroat or cheat. The shadow of ego says, I am fiercely territorial. The shadow of ego says, I have to be loved, be respected, and given preference by everyone all the time, no matter what. Otherwise, I'll have to get back at you. Shalom. Notice the words have to and how they reveal the compulsive element of egoic reaction. This is the opposite of the pause that makes free choice and new alternatives possible. All right, here's another list of healthy ego versus unhealthy ego. Actually, no, this is more of a banishing and invoking list. As I let go of having to get my way, I become more able to cooperate with others. As I let go of having to be noticed and appreciated by everyone, I become more able to ask for, give, and receive appreciation. As I let go of having to insist my misdeeds be overlooked, I become more able to apologize and make amends, as well as grow and develop. As I let go of having to insist I not be shown up or shown to be wrong, I become more able to do my best and still be open to feedback. As I let go of having to be utterly devastated if I lose face, I become more able to admit an error and protect myself from being shamed. Huge. As I let go of having to make demands on others, I become more able to ask for what I want and be able to accept no for an answer. As I let go of having to win, be loved, be respected, and be given preference, I am more able to do my best, ask for rightful credit, and let go. As I let go of having to get back at others, I have become more able to have a sense of justice that asks for redress or amends without the need to punish. As I let go of having to assert the implacability of ego, I become more able to discover the indestructibility of the soul. All right, next section. We have neurotic ego reactions versus healthy ego responses. Neurotic ego reactions are, I act with animosity and retaliation. Healthy ego responses, I ask for amends or an apology. Neurotic ego reacts, I seek to continue it by ongoing resentment. Healthy ego response, I seek to finish it by compensation or restitution. Neurotic ego, this equals threat. Healthy ego, this equals dialogue. Neurotic ego, this will lead to alienation. Healthy ego, this will lead to reconciliation. Neurotic ego, the person who does this is feared and hated. Healthy ego response, the person who does this is trusted and respected. Now, here is what the commitments of a defenseless and resourceful program might look like. Excuse me. I let myself feel this hurt fully, without any defense against it. I vow not to retaliate. I declare directly to the person the impact of his or her behavior on me without blaming or shaming. I ask for amends if appropriate. I accept the fact of occasional inconsiderateness or meanness as a given of human life. I accept the fact of occasional inconsiderateness or meanness as a given of human life. I am determined not to be mean myself. I dedicate these 5 commitments to the welfare of others, both those who are hurt and those who do the hurting. May compassion increase in me and flow from me as a result of what I suffer. May love grow in others as the result of my commitment not to inflict suffering. I forgot. I think there's only 2 there. Anyway. So it's the 5 before. That's right. That's why that was confusing. Okay. Now, to let go of ego is to admit our fear and then to act against it by saying yes to the conditions the ego was set up to protect itself against in the first place. It might even be as simple as using affirmations such as these. I embrace my aloneness and open myself to support. I accept the changes that keep happening around and in me. I grieve and let go of what is passing away. I embrace what is coming to pass and feel excited by it. I live through pain and am transformed by it. I keep finding creative responses to the unpredictable surprises of life. I grieve about unfairness and act fairly in all my dealings. I acknowledge that some burdens are too hard for me and ask for support from beyond myself. I open myself to the graces that keep inviting me to let go of ego. Then there's a quote from Dante's Purgatorio here. To return again to where I am, I make this journey. Okay. Now, we have another list of world of ego and the world of self. So, punishment versus rehabilitation, war versus negotiated settlements, competition versus cooperation, win-lose versus win-win, feud versus reconciliation, retaliation versus asking for amends, grudge versus forgiveness, sarcasm and ridicule versus harmless humor, control versus freedom, fear-based decisions versus courageous risk, the worst will happen, the best can happen, greed, generosity, me first, we always, use others, respect others, take advantage of weakness, treat weakness with kindness. Okay. Now, this is another practice. How do we detect the presence of our shadow? It may appear in crisis and transition, dreams, surprising or sudden impulsive behavior, quantum leaps in intuition, virtue, or talent, envy of someone who has a quality we lack, our reaction to people who bring out our worst or best, synchronicity, paranoia and bigotry, miraculous and healing powers, seeing or hearing of evil deeds, friends' ways of acting or reacting to us, doing to others what we hate they're doing to us. The golden rule is a shadow practice. Inner parallel voices that tempt us to act meanly, and what slips out in humor. Very good. All right. A few more points here. The practice of dealing with anger and abuse. So, true anger is authentic self-expression. Abuse is theatrical display and tantrum. So we'll say ego versus, or we'll say self versus shadow. So self is authentic self-expression. Shadow is theatrical display, tantrum. Self is meant to express a feeling. Shadow is meant, I don't like the way that that's worded. True anger versus abuse. Okay, we'll just stick with that. True anger is authentic self-expression. Abuse is theatrical display and tantrum. True anger is meant to express a feeling. Abuse is meant to manipulate. True anger arises from displeasure at injustice. Abuse arises from an affront to ego. True anger informs the other and creates rapt attention. Abuse scares the other and drives him or her away. True anger, or drives them away. True anger is meant to communicate. Abuse is meant to silence, intimidate, or dump on the other. True anger desires a response from the other but does not require one. Abuse insists the other acknowledge how right or justified one is. True anger allows for perspective. Abuse is trapped in the heat of the moment. True anger takes responsibility for this feeling at one's own and sees the other as a catalyst. Abuse blames the other for what one feels and sees the other as a cause. True anger asks for change but allows the other to change or not. Abuse makes a demand that the other change. There's a whole lot of these, but those are some examples. Okay, moving on. We have more lists here. Negative shadow, what we see in others but do not notice in ourselves. Addictiveness, anxiety, approval seeking, arrogance, attachment, bias, bitterness, grudge holding, blind obedience, capitulation, caretaking, clinging, coercion, compromise, compulsion, compulsive orderliness. Oh boy, there's so many. Those are just some examples. Now, the light aspects of those, the positive shadow, the kernel of lively energy we have in us but potentially do not see. Steadfastness, excitement, openness to appreciation, self-confidence, self-credit, involvement, discernment, refusal to overlook injustice, loyalty, compromise, compassion, loyalty, persuasion, negotiability, reliability, and follow-through, organization, and efficiency. There's like 3 or 4 pages of these. Okay. Now, one thing that I also like from the shifts that happen section. This says, number 1, separation of body and soul. Now, this is temporarily, not permanently. Separation of body and soul creates a union of soul and spirit. So when you can essentially turn your senses inward, or when you can separate, when you can dissolve from the impressions of your atmosphere and environment. Separation of body and soul creates a union of soul and spirit. Number 2, soul-spirit unity rejoins the body. And 3, soul-spirit-body unity joins the world soul. Very good. Lastly, we have an epilogue here called Jacob's Ladder. Now, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages. So I'm going to read these really quickly, and then, we'll be done. If you're still here and you want to hear this, very cool. If not, I understand. This video is already getting kind of long for modern attention. Now, epilogue, Jacob's Ladder. Jacob's story in Genesis is full of shadow references. Jacob was a fellow who always found a way out of things, one who could always charm his way to do what he wanted. When his charms failed, Jacob had to run from his homeland. This was out of character for someone as shrewd and resourceful as Jacob. He was bereft of his ego resources, and his familiar landscape was left behind. This is how we know something spiritual is afoot. The puny ego is ready to be nurtured to greatness by the self. Jacob stopped for the night because the sun had set, as in quotations. This is the stop moment, a necessary pause. Now keep in mind that symbols mean many things. This is the stop moment, the necessary pause, when we can achieve no more by the light of consciousness. We have to visit the underworld, the shadow unconscious, where effort ends and ancestral wisdom begins. It is the dark night of the soul that grants access to the deepest reaches of the positive cosmic shadow. The God who will be encountered in the darkness of our personal shadow. With a stone for a pillow, Jacob dreamed of a ladder connecting earth and heaven. He also anointed the stone with shemen, oil, but shemen. So, we're actually going to pause for that. The stone is often a reference, a metaphor for a foundation. Yesod is a foundation. This is one of the meanings of the sword and the stone. If you can take the oil, the shemen, from Malkuth up to Yesod, perhaps the ladder will begin its construction. With a stone for a pillow, Jacob dreamed of a ladder connecting earth and heaven, with angels ascending and descending, a metaphor for the end of dualism, affirming that all the possibilities of spiritual access are now activated. Angels are the healing third that arises between earth and heaven. God appeared at the top of the ladder, promising, "I will give you the land on which you are lying. I will increase your descendants and be with you always." When he awoke, Jacob exclaimed, "Surely the Lord is here, and I was unaware of it. How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God and gate of heaven." He then stood the stone upright, poured oil on it, and named the place Bethel, house of God, Bet-El. House of God. Unaware refers to his unconscious state. The shadow is a suitable locus for his vision of the transcendent because it is beyond the reach of his conscious ego's intellect and will. The familiar inner shelter he has finally relinquished. Jacob then shows ritual reverence, that is, conscious attention, ritual reverence, which is conscious attention, to the place in nature where the vision occurred. This is mindfulness as well as an active imagination response to his dream. If you don't know this already, there you fucking go. Jacob received his spiritual mandate in and through nature. So now we're even getting into something like shamanism now. He was granted a sense of trust that safety would attend him in life and he would be supported on his journey. Jacob headed for Haran, but now he realized that this very place was his destination. He had found the passport to paradise and the shadow of his own tradition. The place he stopped at was once an ancient pagan shrine to a stone god. Hence the stone that becomes a shrine. Yeah. The place he stopped at was once an ancient pagan shrine to a stone god. Hence the stone that becomes a shrine. A shrine is a holy place, a place where wholeness can be revealed and granted. Jacob was grieving for the loss of his family. Grief is often the prelude to spiritual riches and awakening in heroic stories. Remember that Demeter was grieving the loss of Persephone when she gave the gift of agriculture to humankind and the promise of an endless cycle of fecundity from barrenness. Life from death, light from darkness. Here is also the grieve psychology and grow. Here is also the connection between the psychological and the spiritual. We grieve psychologically and grow spiritually. Ego opens by its yes to the work and is often, Ego opens by its yes to the work and is then confirmed by the transforming power of the self. In Christian myth, Mary mournfully holds the broken body of Jesus as depicted in the Pieta, and is thereby the midwife to his resurrection. The broken and disintegrated is reconstituted and integrated. This is the sanguine mystery of destruction and regeneration. Jacob is not at an oasis, but in the midst of the wasteland. Jacob is a wasteland within as well, full of remorse, grief, and fear. In the midst of the darkest despair is the opening to revelation, because the sun had set. In the most delicate and darkest place, we find the stairway to heaven. In other words, what looks to the ego like uncompromising barrenness is readiness for abundance. Opposites combine, and paradoxes abound. Changeling's poem becomes even clearer. The horseman of enlightenment comes from the west where the sun had set. The wasteland is the only suitable ground into which this figure of enlightenment can enter. This is the same land referred to by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers. I've heard it in the chillest land. Even a Christmas, it's hyphenated, even a Christmas carol of our livelihood said it. In thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. In thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. We have known all this for years. We may wonder why Jacob chose a stone as a pillow, yet every reader of this book has many relatives who sleep against a stone. Tombstones. Tombstones represent the immortal durability of the soul. There is an archetypal and alchemical theme in human history connecting stone, the unconscious, the divine, and destiny. In ancient times, a practice in a temple was the incubation of dreams. One contacted an oracle by sleeping with their head against a sacred stone. The abode of the god. A dream was sent from the god in response to a question or as a healing of a malady. There is also the story of the pharaoh Thutmose IV, who was sleeping under the stone head of the Sphinx when he dreamed that his destiny was securely promised by the gods. 2 more pages. Jacob's dream is a healing and empowering theophany. He finds the numinous residing in nature. The stone becomes the launching pad to the non-dual dimension. This, earth, my soul, is the house of God and gate of heaven. Is this the same philosopher's stone of alchemy that fell from the crown of Lucifer in the battle between opposing forces of good and evil? After his vision, Jacob is no longer arrogant and wily. Now his humbled ego faces an immensity that loves him unconditionally. Since this happens to him while he is guilty and a fugitive, he receives what he does not deserve. This shows he has left the ego world of retaliation behind and entered the kingdom of reconciling grace. The divine has befriended the human shadow. Jacob has been given the grace to see the spiritual figure and ground, the self's design behind the ego's display. God was here and I did not know it. We saw this before in Hakuin's poem. This very place, the lotus paradise. Perennial wisdom is one unanimous chorus about the dismantling of the fortress of inflated ego and the befriending of its shadow so that I can become part of what protects us. The story of Jacob gathers so many of the themes of this book and of our lives. It contains grief, as does every human story. It also presents the theme of a journey. In it, nature is the locus of the spiritual. Jacob's story is about an encounter between the divine and the human, and the connection between the persona and the shadow, both negative and positive. In this story, psychological issues mesh with spiritual issues. It promises that we can work on ourselves by saying yes to a moment that wants to happen and be worked on by the graceful momentum that follows. Well said. Man, Jacob's steps to Bethel are followed by shifts in Jacob's heart. These are the steps and shifts that connect effort and grace, and that constitute the integration of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of our humanity. Jacob's ladder seems to symbolize the spiritual shape of our human journey. It is an ellipse. We begin on the ground and our daily life grind, with all its upheavals and challenges. Then we rise like kneaded dough to the light of the transpersonal dimension of our life and identity. Rejoice that your names are written in heaven. We then return by way of descent, as Moses did from Sinai and Jesus did from Tabor, with gifts of wisdom and compassion to share. Jacob's vision is the combination and composition of opposites, ascent and descent. The ascent is about our yearning for spiritual. The descent is about the zeal of the transcendent for involvement with us. The whole ladder and its traffic is about the integration of our psychological and spiritual work, as well as other things. We might also say we descend by force or choice into the lonely void to face our own darkness. The void is the shadow side of fear, yet void is also unbounded potential, since it's spacious and presents no obstacle to exploring our depths. This is the descent that rescues and releases the pieces of our souls that were awaiting reunion with the wholeness of the self. In both the ascent, descent, and the descent, ascent, we return with riches and fluent in love. By descending into the negative shadow work, we ascend into our positive shadow possibilities. Our best is in our worst, when these opposites unite. Then effort yields to grace and darkness to light. Our very nature is, and always was, the light that is transmitted to us and through us. It took this long to know it, and we knew it all along. The world is a smiling place. St. Augustine. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please leave them below. This was one of the longer book reviews, but it also sort of doubled as an instruction to beginner shadow work. Anyway, again, let me know if you have any questions or comments below, or you can feel free to email me as always. And yeah, have a good rest of the day, good rest of the week, and take care. I hope to see you in the next one.